There are growing signs in Jerusalem that the third temple might not just be a dream for some, but a real plan in motion. A prominent Israeli minister, Ben Gvir, just prayed at the Temple Mount. Groups are quietly preparing vessels and garments for sacrifice. And a red heifer, yes, the one required for purification, has already arrived in Israel. So is Israel preparing to rebuild the third temple? What would that mean for Jews, for Christians, and honestly for the entire world? In today's episode, we're diving into what the Third Temple is and why it matters in both Jewish and Christian thought, the political and religious events making headlines today, and also why some Christians are cheering while others are sounding the alarm. This is one of the most prophetic, controversial, and misunderstood issues in religion and geopolitics. So we're going to talk about it today. So to understand the controversy around the Third Temple, we have to go back in time, because according to some, it's about ancient worship, divine promises, and radically different interpretations of prophecy. The first temple, built by King Solomon, was the center of Jewish worship until it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Decades later, the second temple was rebuilt. It stood for nearly 600 years until it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD during the siege of Jerusalem. Since then, observant Jews have mourned its loss. Orthodox groups pray daily for its rebuilding, believing it's essential to the coming of the Messianic age. Today, groups like the Temple Institute in Jerusalem have already created priestly garments, ritual vessels, and blueprints for a future third temple. Some even claim to be training Kohanim. These are descendants of the priestly line, who will serve for future service in the temple. But for Christians, the idea of rebuilding a temple is, quite frankly, divisive. Let's break it down. Many Christian Zionists, especially within dispensationalist circles, believe the third temple is a prophetic necessity. They point to passages like 2 Thessalonians 2, where Paul talks about the man of sin, or the Antichrist, taking his seat in the temple of God. Or the book of Revelation chapter 11, which speaks of a future temple being measured. This is why some believe that the temple must be rebuilt before Jesus returns. So some Christians support Jewish efforts to rebuild the temple, not for salvation through sacrifice, but as a sign that prophecy is unfolding. On the other hand, many Christians, especially in historic traditions like Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and part of the Reformed Protestant tradition, oppose the idea of a new temple. They believe the true temple was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who called his body the temple. As Hebrews 10 says, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. To rebuild the temple or reinstitute sacrifices is to them a rejection of the gospel. Some even go further, arguing that a third temple would be part of a great deception linked to the Antichrist. So the divide is deep. While the early church spiritualized the temple and saw Christ as its fulfillment, modern prophecy teachers often take a more literal approach. So while Christian Zionists may see the third temple as a sign of hope, others see it as a tragic sign of confusion or even judgment. So where you land on the third temple often depends on your theology. And as we're going to see next, this isn't just theology. It's playing out right now in headlines and political action. Which brings us to the next point. Why did Israeli minister Ben Gvir cause outrage by praying on the Temple Mount? And could that be a sign of what's coming next? So let's take a look at what's happening right now on the ground in Jerusalem. Just recently, Israel's national security minister Ben Gvir made headlines by praying openly on the Temple Mount, a site that's deeply contested, sacred to both Jews and Muslims. This wasn't just a quiet visit, it was a deliberate move, and it sparked global backlash. The Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, is the third holiest site in Islam. According to a fragile arrangement in place since 1967, Jews are allowed to visit the site, but not to pray there. So when a high-ranking Israeli official prays there, it's seen by many as provocation and even a threat to the status quo. Condemnation was swift. Muslim leaders across the region from Jordan, Saudi Arabia to Turkey all condemned this act. Some warned that it could ignite a religious war. Jordan, the custodian of the site, said that it was an unacceptable provocation, and Hamas called it a deepening of the ongoing aggressions against the Palestinian people. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said the visit crossed all red lines. Meanwhile, the Israeli government walks a tightrope. Officially, they say there are no plans to change the status quo. But behind the scenes, religious traditionalist voices are gaining more influence, and many of them are openly calling for Jewish prayer and ultimately a rebuilt temple. 9 in the evening, and today also in Israel. I hope with God's help that we are not only mourning, but also thinking about building and sovereignty, about governance. We can do it. We have done it in many places, and we will do it everywhere with God's help, and soon also in Gaza, and the building of the temple. Something you would want to happen soon is certainly a big dream. Today we're doing what hasn't been done in 1,000 years on the Temple Mount, both in prayers and in songs. I hope we will continue to progress more and more. The Temple Mount is ours. Thank you very much. Religious Zionist movements are playing a bigger role than ever in Israeli politics. Groups that once existed on the fringes are calling for the rebuilding of the temple and now are part of the government. And they're not just talking, they're fundraising, lobbying, and creating practical infrastructure from priestly training to sacrificial altars. That brings us back to the Temple Mount, where tensions are constantly simmering. Jewish activists are pushing for greater access. Muslim authorities, backed by international pressure, are pushing back hard. And in the middle stands one of the most contested pieces of real estate on the planet. So is the temple closer than we think? Well, maybe not tomorrow, but the groundwork is certainly being laid. And for those watching prophecy, politics, or both, this isn't just something to ignore. In the next section, we're going to explore how different Christian groups will perceive this development based on the book of Ezekiel and also the book of Revelation. Right now, a lot of people online are talking about the third temple, and there's a lot of different comments and perspectives. One Catholic says, why do many Christians want the Jews to rebuild a third temple in Jerusalem, believing it will kick off the second coming of Christ? Doesn't the prophet Daniel say this will never happen? And more importantly, Jesus himself is the third temple. Another Christian says there will be a third temple, and that is the one that Satan will sit in at the end of time. One commenter points out that, well, the third temple is prophesied by the book of Ezekiel. A Christian comments and says Christians are the third temple. A different Christian says the third temple was already built. It's called Christ. A Muslim then comments and says the third temple has already been built and it looks beautiful, and he's referencing the Dome of the Rock. Clearly there's a lot of different perspectives here, but what stood out to me the most was the Catholic who asked, where's this even coming from? Seemingly unaware of the biblical arguments and proof texts that Christian Zionists will use to substantiate their position that a third temple will be rebuilt. And one commenter rightly pointed out, well, you have the prophecy in the book of Ezekiel, and that's what I want to focus on right now. In chapters 40 through 48 of the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel describes in extraordinary detail a massive temple, its dimensions, the rooms, the gates, even how the priests are supposed to dress. To many Christian Zionists, especially dispensationalists, this is not just symbolic, it's a blueprint for the future. And that's because none of the temples that have already been built meet the dimensions of the one described in Ezekiel. So they believe this is a literal temple that will be rebuilt during a future millennial reign of Christ, where Israel will be restored physically and spiritually. In this view, Ezekiel's temple is the third temple. But historical Christianity, among Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, has taken a very different view. From the earliest centuries, church theologians and church fathers understood Ezekiel's temple as a symbolic vision, not a construction project. They believed Ezekiel was describing the church itself, the spiritual temple made up of living stones where Christ is the high priest and believers are the priesthood. This is why 1 Peter 2:5 says, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house. In this view, Ezekiel's temple isn't about going backward to animal sacrifices, which is mentioned in Ezekiel's temple, but it's about God revealing the spiritual order of the new covenant. Christian Zionists also turn to the book of Revelation, especially chapter 11. There, John is told to measure the temple, but not the outer court, which has been given to the nations. For dispensationalists and Christian Zionists, this is another clue. A literal Jewish temple must exist in the end times, likely during a future tribulation period. They believe the Antichrist will desecrate this temple, triggering the final sequence of events before Christ's return. Again, the temple is physical, and prophecy is fulfilled in real time and real space in Jerusalem. But historically, Revelation has often been read as symbolic, not architectural. Early Christians and most church traditions since have read the book of Revelation's visions as deeply allegorical, pointing to spiritual truths about the church, persecution, judgment, and redemption. They see the temple in Revelation not as a future building, but as the church in the midst of a trial. And in fact, some have tried to make a connection between the dimensions of the temple in Ezekiel and the dimensions of the temple described in the book of Revelation, trying to say that the one described by Ezekiel is the one described by the book of Revelation. But then we get to the end of the book of Revelation, Revelation 21. John writes something stunning. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. That's the climax of Christian hope, according to some. Not a return to animal sacrifice, but the fullness of God dwelling with his people with no need for a physical temple at all. So here's the divide. Christian Zionists expect a literal temple to rise soon in Jerusalem, and thus they support the rebuilding of the temple. Historical Christian perspectives, however, believe those prophecies were always meant to be fulfilled in Christ and his church in a more symbolic and allegorical sense. So the idea of a third temple isn't just a topic for historians or theologians. It's something that's unfolding right now in politics, religion, and even in global headlines. For some, the third temple represents hope, a long-awaited fulfillment of prophecy and the return of divine order. For others, it signals a great deception or even the rise of Antichrist. And still for many, it could mean the beginning of unimaginable conflict in the most volatile place on earth. So here's the question that I want to leave with you. Do you think a third temple will be built in our lifetime? And if it is, what would it mean for Israel, for the church, and for the world? I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or just curious. Drop a comment below. Let's keep the conversation respectful, thoughtful, and rooted in truth. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with somebody who's curious about this topic. Also visit patreon.com/Reason of Theology, where you can go to support my work. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep seeking the truth.